Okay, so there's no doubt that with generative AI, writing code and building software is nothing like it's ever been before. And of course, there's no telling just how much more things are going to change. Like every day, this thing is evolving. And as someone who loves to write code and build software, all this uncertainty about the future's got me just a little bit freaked out. All right, so what do I do with this uncertainty? Well, POC or GTFO. Dive in head first and turn all those assumptions into real world experiences. And so I decided to build an app from beginning to end, concept to delivery. More specifically, I wanted to build an iPhone app, a little doodle app that I could push to the App Store and anybody could download. Now, I already got a little bit of experience developing iPhone apps, but that was mostly with Unity or hacking some hand-me-down Objective-C. What I really wanted to do was build this app in a language I've never used before, like Swift. Code it with Xcode, with all those iOS platform goodies. Get the user interface looking tight. And of course, to make things more complicated, well, haven't exactly been coding in a while. These days, I'm more of a software architect, and at most, I'm diving into other people's code or slapping together the occasional prototype. But what I haven't been doing is getting all the way into the trenches, getting lost on Stack Overflow, wrestling with those weird bugs that turn 8 p.m. into 2 a.m. real quick. And here's the thing. I wanted to build it exclusively using GPT-4, the smart one. They say that Copilot X is going to be backed by GPT-4, so by rights, I figure the quality of the code generated by the chatbot should be just as good. Now, if you follow the hype, like every other post on LinkedIn, GPT is either a worthless hallucinating probability machine, or it's set to replace all software developers by the end of the year. Of course, the truth is somewhere in between, and more than that, it's actually a lot more interesting. Now, before I dive in and talk about how I built that iPhone app, I want to go over some GPT essentials. First of all, you're going to want to pony up the cash and just pay for the GPT-4. The new model was trained on a whole lot more data, and it's much better at keeping track of the different pieces of the conversation. And it ain't going to wig out so much with all that hallucinating. That means you can throw a lot more code at it, and it's not going to lose track of your actual requirements. More importantly, it's going to give you higher quality responses. Now, because you're paying for it, you get early access to some of the newer features. Like now you can pre-prompt it with custom instructions. You tell it a little bit about yourself and a little bit about how you want it to behave. No more breaking the fourth wall with this, as an AI model, blah, blah, blah. This is a big deal because now you don't got to constantly remind it that you're an expert software developer with 20 years of professional experience. The responses are going to be tailor-made for your situation. But most importantly, you're also going to get better responses. GPT is a probability machine, and if you don't say otherwise, it's probably going to give you mediocre responses because half the data that it's trained on is mediocre. So set your expectations high, and you're going to get better results. Another beta feature that's helped me out a lot is the code interpreter. They just renamed it to Advanced Data Analysis. Now, I didn't take advantage of its ability to actually run and test inline Python, although that feature is still pretty freaking cool. But when you select this particular mode, it's a lot more contextually attuned to questions about code. And added to that, it comes with this really useful feature to upload text files. That means you don't got to feed it with multiple prompts so it can read your super large class files. This way, GPT is able to keep track of the latest version of your code and give you much more relevant responses. This is an essential feature for being able to iterate on your code pretty much indefinitely. And I'm sure this will be more seamless when Copilot X comes along, but for now, it's pretty effective the way it is. Okay, so let's talk about how I built this app. A few months back, I went to Denver to hang out with an old buddy of mine, an artist named Justin Martin. I joined him at a Comic-Con where he was selling a series of pose reference books that he had hand-drawn and published. He created these books to help artists get better at drawing, to help them design characters for the comic books or graphic novels. Now, being the software developer that I am, I thought it'd be kind of cool if I could just whip up some sort of iPhone app using Justin's art. Something that could also be used by artists, help them practice by tracing over random poses, and maybe they could post their drawings on Instagram or something. Basically, I was looking for an excuse to develop a simple app with a simple purpose. And really, more importantly, I was looking for an excuse to see if I could get GPT to help me code something that might actually be useful. So at this point, I pulled GPT in on the conversation, and sitting there at Justin's booth, I asked it to tell me a little something about drawing components or libraries for iOS. Particularly, I was looking for something I wouldn't have to buy or license. I just wanted to build something artists could download for free from the App Store. And sure enough, GPT recommended that I use Apple's Pencil Kit. It's a framework that lets users sketch out drawings with their fingers or an Apple Pencil directly into the app. Perfect. And that's when I realized that this is actually something I could build. Now, by the time I got home, I was ready to start tinkering and see what I could make of this really cool idea. Of course, at this point, I still wasn't quite convinced that GPT could totally pull it off. So I started simple, bust out a few proofs of concept and see how far I could push this thing. And as I said before, it's been a few years since I used Xcode, and I've certainly never taken the time to properly learn Swift. So that's where I had to start from the beginning, spin up a hello world and get it to run on my iPhone. Of course, that involved a whole lot more than just spitting out a single line of text. That meant downloading Xcode from Apple's App Store, creating a new Swift project, and trying to make sense of the IDE's weird-ass interface. Now, I ain't going to lie and tell you that I got it right the first time. GPT's knowledge about Xcode is a little outdated, and Apple's always making tweaks, but we did eventually get there, and I got it running in the simulator pretty quick. Of course, that wasn't going to be enough because, as you know, it don't count if the app can't actually run on the physical device. And yeah, that's much easier said than done. Turns out my Apple developer certificate and account apparently had expired, and I couldn't remember squat about the developer provisioning process or whatever they call it. But that's fine. You see, GPT's got infinite patience, and I really felt no shame in asking all the dumb questions until it gave me the instructions that I needed. So after paying my $99 developer fee, I finally got my Hello World working the way I wanted it to. After that, it was time to ratchet things up and take the pencil kit for a spin. Funny thing is, that was actually much easier to get working right the first time. And just like before, I had GPT give me baby steps and really dumb it down for me. Act like I'd never coded on a Mac before. And anytime the responses were too vague, I just kept hitting back, asking more questions. And I got to be honest, this process was way more efficient than pouring through ad-riddled websites or threads of incorrect responses on Stack Overflow. Most of all, GPT remembered the conversation, so it was able to adjust to my feedback and fine-tune all the replies pretty quick. So at this point, I got the confidence to move forward and see if I could start fleshing out the entire application. And I was eager to start taking chances and just bang on the code until I had something proper to submit to the Apple App Store. Now, I'm a big fan of iterative development, agile with a little a. That said, I wasn't quite ready to go down the rabbit hole just yet. I had to get my stuff backed up into a proper repository like GitHub. That way I wouldn't be chicken to take chances with the code. I could just roll things back anytime I wanted, especially when things started to get complicated. Of course, it's been a while since I spun up a repo and hooked it up into Xcode, and I definitely wanted to have all my code changes highlighted and commit them with just a push of a button. Once again, GPT turned out to be a great coach with infinite patience, and it didn't judge me for forgetting how to do that basic add commit push stuff. GPT walked me through all the basic steps of setting up the repo on GitHub, and it pretty much knew how to navigate the site, mostly. After whipping up a nice little .gitignore file, it had me use the terminal to push all that existing proof of concept code up into the repo, safe and sound. At one point, I did have trouble figuring out how to use that GitHub personal access token inside of Xcode. I guess they don't use passwords anymore, so GPT showed me how to get that sorted out as well. Every time I got stumped by the interface or the terminal, I just played dumb and described the situation, and GPT got me to where I needed to go. From there on out, my routine was pretty simple. Over the next couple of weeks, at the end of the day, I'd take my laptop and a glass of beer and head upstairs to my room and plop into my recliner. And then I'd have a little fun coding. Nothing too serious. Like, by the time my beer was finished and GPT had run out of steam, I'd check in the code and close my laptop for the night. Now, some days I put in more time than others, but I wasn't feeling any stress about cutting into family time or video game time. And all said, I didn't put in much more than about 40 hours total on the project by the time I'd finished. You see, most nights I could bang out a couple of features in about an hour or two, On those days, I felt like a 10x developer. For example, one of the smaller features I added was this little About button on the main page that would pop open a modal and display all that legalese crap: privacy policy, copyright, information about the app. I gave GPT some bare bones instructions and then pasted the current state of my code right there under the prompt. And it was pretty cool. It responded with step-by-step instructions and updates to the code. Now, it was almost too clever because it assumed I had already created an About view controller, and the code it gave me was trying to make calls to the non-existent file. And so I let GPT know that this file didn't exist yet. And of course, it had no problem spitting out all the necessary code for the new file. And then I just plopped it into the project. And in this case, I got lucky. The code built and ran as advertised correctly the first time. So I got greedy and started copying and pasting a bunch of loosely typed out copyright info and privacy policy details. And I asked GPT to clean it up for me and make it somewhat organized and presentable. Now, at this point, I got to remind you, I don't know Swift, or at least I didn't. So I kept following up with stupid little questions about formatting. I even nitpicked the text alignment. Real basic stuff. But that's okay. I was learning. Me and GPT kept going back and forth, tweaking the pop-up. We made it full screen, standardized the colors, the fonts. At one point, I did get a warning about some deprecated window object code, and that's okay because iOS is always making updates, and GPT just kept responding with updated code snippets. Helped me get that fixed real quick. I think the key to successfully prompting and getting good code is to be extra wordy and descriptive. Like, don't hold back on the details. Now, I'm not going to lie and tell you everything was peaches and cream. Most days, GPT helped me feel like a rock star. But some days, we'd hit that very same wall that all developers are oh so familiar with. Some days, no matter how many ideas you throw at a problem, it just might feel like there's no way through. Of course, the difference here is that GPT is supplied with infinite patience, and no matter how many times I kept coming back with tweaks and adjustments to my prompts, or how much I typed out my frustration, cursing and grumbling, GPT would just do its best and try to give me what I wanted. Now, a lot of the time, if it gave me garbage, it was because my prompts were garbage. This usually happened when I was debugging visual elements in the UI. Troubleshooting the layout constraints was a total pain because I didn't have the words at the time to differentiate safe area, navigation bar, and status bar. This all affected the dynamic sizing and alignment of elements. And it got real weird when I was testing against different versions of the iPhone with and without notches or islands. Some of the bugs were just frustrating. Apparently, when you trigger nested system pop-ups, you can't easily intercept the shake to undo feature because of accessibility reasons. This caused so many issues with the first responder not being properly triggered after the pop-ups finally closed, and that had an impact on PencilKit's built-in sliding functionality. That one had me and GPT scratching our heads for quite some time. Finally, GPT suggested I do something bold, like override the actual window with a custom object where I could just intercept the shaking event. And it worked, but it was super spooky and way out of my comfort zone. So I had GPT write out a ton of explanatory comments in line with all the hacky code, so I'd be reminded later if I ever had to open it up again. My most frustrating evenings with GPT were usually, in the end, my own fault. Like, I wanted to add a feature to enable users to zoom and scroll Justin's reference art and their hand-drawn art together. This would allow them to add those little details to the drawings, even though they were drawing from a tiny screen. I figured this would be a make-or-break feature. And the bug took me a few days to figure out. I had to roll the code back at least a dozen times. Objects kept getting positioned out of whack or scaling in different directions. And worst of all, at one point, GPT had me code an infinite loop that instantly crashed the app because I thought it'd be a good idea to recreate the canvas object every time the user triggered the zoom event. But you know what? This one was totally on me. You see, GPT did suggest the correct answer right at the beginning. It was like, dude, put all your objects inside of a parent container and just use a basic scroll view to move it around. But you see, that seemed too difficult at the time because I didn't know Swift. So instead, I kept making things worse for myself by asking GPT to find an easier way. Like I was literally asking it to give me shitty code. But we did get there eventually. And when we did, it was hilarious because it only took a fraction of all that messy code to make things work the way they were supposed to work. Now, as the project progressed, something really neat happened. I was gaining real developer experience. I was learning Swift, even on the bad days. And that meant my prompting got better bit by bit. And at one point, it was even faster for me to manually type out the code. And then, of course, I shared it with GPT so it could give me an attaboy. I swear to God, it gave me a fist bump at one point. Now, you might be thinking that it's a little weird of me to personify GPT the way I'm describing it. Like I'm shouting at it, praising it, and it's congratulating me when I'm not making boneheaded mistakes. But honestly, I think that's kind of a healthy thing to do. You know, a lot of us developers aren't so good at this communicating thing. And because GPT seemed to do its best work when you treat it like a real person, because that's the way it was trained, you kind of get rewarded when you do. And don't tell me that's weird. We do it all the time with NPCs and role-playing games. It's good practice. All right, so GPT did a fine job of helping me build an app that actually runs and does what I wanted to. But anyone who's actually built an iPhone app knows that that's only the half of it. You still got to make the icons, the screenshots, configure all that signing and capability stuff, archive it, validate it, fill in all that connect app store information. Then there's the whole distribution process and submitting the build for review. I used to get pretty overwhelmed by all that stuff, but of course, this time around, GPT made it all seem pretty simple. And getting through it didn't take more than about an hour. The validation passed and the review passed on the first try. It had never been this easy for me. Like for reals, it's out there. Go download it if you want. It's free. Now, I got to be honest. You see, for me, writing code and getting lost in the process of solving problems, that's the stuff I love. And what scared me the most about all this generative AI crap was that these fancy new robots were going to take all that away. Like, I was afraid that developers and programmers were going to be reassigned to jobs writing business requirements and automated tests, you know, babysitting. But after taking GPT for more than just a test run, building an app from start to finish, I'm happy to say that I don't think I had anything to be afraid of. You see, instead of taking away the fun bits, I feel like GPT gave me even more room to be creative and fearless, to take chances and learn. It helped me get past my own imposter syndrome. And like I said before, I actually learned a new language. Right now, I'm a software architect, but I gotta be honest. I feel like it's a really exciting time to be a software developer, and I definitely got to make more room for that.